Today I'm absolutely privileged to be joined by Ryan Henson. Ryan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Jamie. It's great to talk to you.
Absolutely is. So, do you want to start us off then with your early days in Hertford? You've always been a Hertford boy, and speak to us about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, moved to Hertford when I was about 3, I think. My dad got a job as a gardener at Haileybury College, so off we went, and then my parents loved it. I mean, because they were both from North London, and before we moved, the three of us were in a block of flats, and it was pretty grim. It was the sort of late 80s. There were syringes in the sort of play area and stuff, and my parents were very, very young, but they, like all good parents, they recognised that we had an opportunity to sort of get away from that and start afresh. And that's what we did. And I went to St. Joseph's School, primary school, which ironically I now live less than a 5-minute walk away. So it's funny, you sort of imagine yourself as exploring the world and doing all of that, and you end up as an adult being 5 minutes away from your primary school, which I think says more about Hertford than it does my lack of ambition. And I also went to Morgan's. My parents worked long hours. My mum was a dinner lady. Dad was obviously a gardener. So I went to Morgan's because it had a good after school club. So in a way, I made friends with people from across the town. That was the upside. And have sort of moved to Little Berkhamsted with my parents as a sort of teenager, but have come back to Hertford as an adult through choice. So yeah, that's my potted Hertford story.
Well, that's really interesting you say that because I'm not fortunate enough to have been alive in the 80s and 90s, but we grew up in North London and then moved to Hertford, ironically enough. And yeah, I mean, what is it about Hertford that really tickles your fancy, if you like, because it is a really unique place to be.
Yeah, I mean, the historian in me just loves the history of Hertford. I just sort of grew up thinking that every town had a castle, and obviously most towns don't. And I'll mangle my sort of pre-Victorian history now, which is not my strong suit. But I'm pretty sure that sort of the French king after the Battle of Poitiers was kept prisoner in the castle. I mean, this is just crazy stuff. The fact that Parliament met in Hertford during I think the plague or the Great Fire. Again, I've probably mangled that. People who listen to this will be horrified. But, incredible stuff has happened in our small town over the years. It's really extraordinary. So that really appeals to me. But I love the fact that Hertford is small enough for you to bump into people at the weekend, but not so small that you bump into the wrong people over and over again. And I have experience of this because having lived in a village, if you're trying to avoid someone, you can't really. And not that, of course, that I was ever trying to avoid anyone, but Hertford is special in that sense. And I also think the sense of community in the town is unlike anywhere I've ever lived. And I've been very privileged through my job to travel to some of the far-flung corners of the world. And in some of the communities that have been strongest in terms of their civic DNA, I just think Hertford has so much in common. And it's one of the reasons I got involved in local politics. It's not necessarily because I wanted to be in politics necessarily. It's just that I felt a responsibility. If you look at the heritage of the town and the fact that for millennia this place has been ticking over, it's extraordinary. And I really think that sort of thing, it doesn't happen by accident. It happens because people step forward and do their bit in whatever shape, way, or form it may look like at the time. So there's almost a responsibility to pass on the baton. But yeah, it's amazing. Me and my wife's from North London all her life, and when we were looking to sort of start our own home or start that part of our lives, I said to her, look, we can go anywhere, but let's just look at Hertford. And this woman who grew up with police sirens and having, that makes it sound grim, but having everything that Camden Town has to offer was just sold immediately on Hertford, and we actually, that was it. That was the end of our search. So it's a really special place.
Without a doubt, and I suppose as well, you're not too far from London if you ever wanted to go down there and pop by. Growing up, then, have you always been interested in politics? I know that you've had a degree in history, which is pretty interesting, which I suppose you just alluded to there.
Yeah, I don't know that I was, to be honest. I was always interested in history, and actually, when it came to study, I was convinced, and I'm still convinced, that history is more political than a study of politics, because I think that history is about people and stories in a way that politics as a discipline is a bit more clinical. So, so I sort of feel like I've got the opportunity to get immersed in politics, but just for a different sort of way. But no, I wasn't interested in politics, because my parents, it wasn't something that we grew up talking about. My dad might shout at the TV and stuff, like probably a lot of people at various points, but that was it. For me, I remember I was working in a pub, so I left school without any qualifications when I was 16. I was working in the Five Horseshoes pub, which is about a couple of miles away from the town, and I remember David Cameron talking in 2005. So I was 18, and it was in the sort of middle of the Tory leadership election. He was making his pitch, and it came on the radio in the kitchen. And he said, I remember vividly, he said, "We're not interested in where you've come from. What we care about is where you're going." And with the benefit of 20 years experience, he was trying to blunt the fact that he'd gone to Eton and he was perceived by many to be quite privileged. But I didn't really hear it as that. I heard it as, you went to a crappy school, you're washing up in a pub, but that's okay. If you've got ambition and you want to get on, we're gonna help you, or we're not going to get in the way. And I just thought that was so inspiring, and it was such a contrast to what had come before with Labour, who I always felt spoke down to people from my sort of background. Like, we're going to give you this benefit or that benefit or this and that, and so that was a turning point. And I got interested then, but I was 18, so I wasn't really political as a kid.
Have you always been part of the Conservative Party, and when did you join?
Yeah, so I actually joined a couple of months after hearing that off from David Cameron. I was really, it sounds like corny, but we'd had 13 years. Well, by that point, we'd had 8 years, I think, of Labour. So all my whole sort of consciousness as a sort of teenager had been this sort of technocratic centrism, like Blair sort of, that was it. And there wasn't really a rival until Cameron came along. So I joined up afterwards. I was quite inspired, and yeah, I've been a member ever since. So I'm 38 now. So yeah, it's got 20 years. Yeah.
And I suppose you've been doing some really incredible things throughout that. But can we just touch upon university again? It's a really interesting point. I mean, I've always been quite against the fact that university is the only option to get to your dream job. I think there are ways around it. And I suppose with your history qualification, have you ever used it? I mean, do you think university, in your sense, has potentially been a bit of a lost cause?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I have a sort of appointment as a social mobility commissioner. So appointed by the government with a couple of others. So I've given lots of thought to this, lots and lots of thought. My answer is university shouldn't be the only path, and the fact that so many young people think that it's the only path is not because they're silly or they're not aware of other options. It's because society teaches us that university is the most esteemed path. And what I mean by that is, if a middle-class family are sat around the dinner table with another similar couple or family, and they announce that actually they'd quite like Lucy or Katie, age 17, to become an apprentice, there's almost like a sharp intake of breath. Gosh, why aren't they off to university? Why aren't they doing this? Don't they want to have options and so on? If you think about how that conversation would play out in places like France, it's entirely different. In Paris, to be the head waiter at a really good restaurant makes you like a pillar of society. You are credible, you are esteemed, you are an authority in that sort of society, which we just don't have. So we have to change that outlook. We need to recognise that there's all manner of paths through life, and one isn't superior to the other. It should be tailored around the sort of ambition and the sort of ability of the individual, but also by the needs of the local economy. And I would certainly say that at the moment we have far too many graduates and not nearly enough troops. Recruitment is in crisis in the armed forces, but we're churning out graduates, and I say that as one of them. My own experience, though, having said all of that, is that it was a game changer for me, and I would say I've used my degree a fair bit. I think what history does, I can't speak for other qualifications, but I think history, certainly in my sense, has taught me to think critically. And I think as we embark on this new age of AI and ChatGPT and what's real and what isn't, I'm not saying I, have a sixth sense for what, what isn't accurate and what is, but I think being able to think, hang on a minute, does this stand up? And it's particularly helpful in politics because very often we're fed a narrative, deliberately so, by candidates or their opposition rivals. And I think, as you do in history, being able to look at the different sources and saying, this doesn't seem right, this is more persuasive. So for me, it's been very helpful. But I would certainly agree that not everyone should go, and we should be far more respectful, as respectful to people who don't go as we are that do.
As you touched upon there, you did serve as a reservist in the Royal Air Force, which is a huge thanks for your service. When did you step into that role, and why did you decide that the reservist route was best for you and perhaps not a full-time role in the army?
So I wanted to do it when I finished university. So as I mentioned, I was washing up in a pub instead of doing my A-levels. So I went to university when I was about 21, and I was very fortunate. I got a scholarship, so I stayed on for an extra year. And so, but anyway, by the time I came out, I was 27, I think, and I'd worked before going to university. So I knew what I didn't want to do, and what I didn't want to do was be stuck behind a desk. I wanted to sort of do something else. So my plan was to try and embark on a military career for the adventure, because my granddad had been in the RAF and so on. I got a knee injury which ruled me out, and then I got suckered into politics. I ran a general election campaign in North London in 2015, and I stood for council and I won, and I met my now wife, and blah blah blah. So it didn't happen. And then when I stood for Parliament in 2019 and lost, I thought, right, this is it. I'm only 31 or so. I probably just about can do it reserves at this point because I've already had a career going. And then COVID hit, and so by the time I did it, I think I was mentally, I left it too late. I think physically you can do it up to 55, and I think there's brilliant people that start it later in life and they're great. But I was probably a bit too set in my ways, and so it was probably a bit too late to do it. Why I chose the RAF? My granddad had been in the RAF. I'd heard all the stories, and to be quite frank as well, I went along to an RAF base in Oxfordshire for like an induction day, and I just thought it was awesome. I loved the ethos, and maybe if I'd gone along to the equivalent in the army, I would have enjoyed that too. But I got to the RAF first.
You've done some charitable bits as well, which is really aspiring. CAFOD was the first one, obviously a big, reputable name within that world. What was your best experiences with them before you went on to go and be CEO?
Yeah, so at CAFOD, I mean, I'm a Catholic, so CAFOD is something that, if you go to a Catholic school, if you go to a Catholic church, you know of CAFOD. You may not know why you know about them, but you just have always known about them. I can't really think of a secular equivalent. But anyway, yeah, I was absolutely in my element at CAFOD because my late grandmother, Maureen, this sort of like tiny little Irish lady, she sort of played a massive role in my early life, and she used to sort of take me to church and stuff when I was really small. And she was looking back, she was really poor, they were in social housing, but she always put money in the collection box. She always gave to charity. She always instilled in me this idea that you sort of can't quite think of how she would phrase it, but you help people who for no fault of their own can't help themselves. That was a real value that she sort of instilled in me, and CAFOD embodies that. It's a Catholic agency, but they work with people of all religions and no religions. They don't ask you what your faith is before they try and help you. And as an organisation, at a time when NGOs like CAFOD are getting a really bad rap for all manner of things, CAFOD has staff that have sort of been there for 30 years in the same job. Like, they've not worked their way through, they've just stayed in the same job. So it was a wonderful place to work. You really felt like you were making a difference. And so it was amazingly fulfilling. I really, really enjoyed it.
Before we go on to speak about all of your parliamentary runs and your counselling and all bits and pieces like that, again, you went on to become CEO of Coalition for Global Prosperity, which is, again, like the work that you guys have been doing there has been, again, inspiring. So what other bits and pieces could we learn as people outside looking in that, how do we get involved and what sort of bits do you do?
Yeah, so the CGP, because it is a mouthful of a title. Yeah, I mean, our purpose is to do everything that I was trying to do at CAFOD, but in a more holistic way. So to explain what I mean by that, at CAFOD, I would go and talk to people who were really skeptical of money being spent overseas. They'd say, well, I get that people are suffering overseas, but we've got problems over here too, and our taxes have gone up and public spending's gone down, and I can't get a GP appointment. Why are we spending all the money overseas? And what I try and do at the CGP is make the argument that actually, if you care about national security, if you worry about the rise of Iran and China and the atrocious, wicked behaviour being perpetrated by Putin's Russia, then you need to look at this, through the whole. You need to see the big picture. And actually, if you don't help people who are struggling in poverty, there's a high chance that they'll up sticks and come to the UK via illegal means, which none of us want, certainly not me. If you don't want a situation where terrorism flourishes in a place like Afghanistan, it's far better to educate the population as best you can so that they don't submit psychologically to wicked and awful ideologies. So that's the way to sort of see international development. It's not just a charitable case. It's not just a handout. It's about making sure that we in the UK are safer and more resilient and healthier. So that's what we're about doing. And I would say to anyone who sort of feels the pinch at home, and we all do, anyone who's worried about spending money overseas, I would encourage you to just think about it in those terms and don't take my word for it. Take the word of senior military folk for it. Take their word for it more than mine. And what you find is the veterans who've served overseas are often the very first to come out and say it's really important that we do right by some of the world's poorest people. It's in our national interest.
I think it's become quite trendy, especially with Trump going back for a second term, to cut off all international aid. Look, there are some things that perhaps are questionable that Trump has lied about on many occasions, but about spending overseas. But in countries like Afghanistan, how can sort of an organisation from the West get inside Afghanistan and speak to these people firsthand without the ideologies of the Taliban getting through to them?
Yeah, it's really tough. I think there's some great organisations that are doing it really well, and I would highlight the work of the Halo Trust. And this actually speaks to what I just said about the military. So the guy who runs it is a guy called James Cowan. He commanded UK forces in Helmand during, at the sort of height of the Afghan war. Former Major General. He's someone I'm fortunate to know quite well through my day job. This isn't a shrinking violet. Like, he's not. This guy doesn't suffer fools. I've spoken to people that served under him, and you don't want to cross him. He's one of those characters, and he always makes the point that for many years he was fighting the Taliban, but now his organisation is working in Afghanistan, and so he's very clear that you don't endorse their ideology. You don't, in any shape, way, or form, sort of enable what it is that they're doing, but you can also do really good work for the people of Afghanistan who are who also don't want the Taliban anywhere near them, but it is what it is. And his organisation is a mine clearance charity. Princess Diana famously walked across the minefield with their sort of badge on. So if people listening have heard of the Halo Trust, it might be through them. But anyway, the point is, you can, the more mines they clear, the less likely it is that Afghan children are going to harm or die on those explosives. And then you can have a conversation about education and so on and so forth. And, there's a lot to be done in Afghanistan, most obviously when it comes to the rights of women and girls. But I still think there's good work that can be done.
So with you as the CEO, what do you guys are doing on a day-to-day basis? I'm presuming you guys aren't the ones in Afghanistan.
No, we're not. No, we're not. So our job is to persuade people in power that is in the UK's national interest to take a leadership role on the world stage when it comes to international development, defence, diplomacy. And we do that by taking policymakers out to see the work that goes on in the field. So we will take delegations to places like Kenya, Nepal, Jordan in the Middle East, and we will let them see for themselves what it's like in a refugee camp that the UK is contributing towards maintaining. So, if you think it's all spent poorly, see for yourself and question those who are receiving the money, and then you make up your own mind. We also produce think pieces and research, I guess a bit like a think tank, where we say, okay, maybe you're morally persuaded, you feel it in your heart, but why do we need to spend this much money? And what do we get in return for spending the money? So those pieces of research unpack that and sort of lay out the arguments. We also work with the Americans too. So you mentioned like what Trump is doing. The reality is, I think the famous phrase is America sneezes and the UK catches a cold. We'll also work with partners in the US to make sure that we're aligned with what the good people in DC are trying to do to win these sorts of arguments. And we'll put on events too. We'll try and inform and educate. So, like I said, I can make these arguments and I hope that I'm persuasive, but it's even more interesting when a former general or a bishop or an imam or a business leader or a former prime minister says, actually, when I was sat in, the situation room or Cobra, blah, 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 this is why this is important. So that's what we're about.
Your first ever idea as to running in a campaign when you had to do it yourself was in Bedford and Kempston in 2019. How did you get selected? I want to know about this whole process because I've been speaking to some people over the last few days who have been in your position, and it's a unique process with the Conservative Party.
Yeah, it is. It's it's unique is the word. I mean, it's changed a little bit since then, but I'd been a councillor, so I was councillor in Seal, where I still live. So I'd done 3 years by the time I went for selection. I was selected in 2018, and there was a vacancy. My parents, my mum and stepdad live in Bedford, and Bedford is an hour up the road from Hertford. So yeah, so basically I applied for the selection. I mean, the first thing you need to do is get on the candidates list. So you go through a selection of interviews, you practice your public speaking, you get assessed, and if the party thinks that you are credible, then you get added to a list. If they don't, then they'll say, go and work on this and come back. Anyway, I made it onto the list, and there was a vacancy in Bedford. Brilliant local MP, Tory MP, Richard Fuller, lost his seat in 2017, but he lost it by 900, 800 votes, something like that. And I thought to myself, well, I know Bedford a little bit. My mum and stepdad lived there. I won't for a moment pretend to be local because I'm obviously not. But I've got some ideas about, how we get young people into the workplace, how we widen our sort of opportunities for people that don't normally have access to all that stuff. So we went along, said to my fiance at the time, now wife, I've somehow been longlisted. I think about 100 people applied. I've made the final 12, whatever. So don't worry, there's absolutely no way they'll pick me. I'm 30 years old. I've never stood before, and I'm not from Bedford, so don't worry. Came back and I said, you never guess what? I've made it into the final 3, but don't worry. The 2 I'm up against, one's done 20 years in the Air Force and lives in Bedford, and the other one runs a successful business, employs 20 people, and was born in Bedford and went to school in Bedford. So I said, I'm making up the numbers, it's all good. Anyway, in a way, it was good because I thought to myself, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to speak right from the heart, and I'm going to say exactly what I think. And because I've got nothing to lose, because I'm no way I'm going to win, I'm just going to go out there and like give a barnstorming speech and see what happens. And I won. I ended up winning on the first ballot. So there's a lesson there, I think, for sort of future life. And Paul and Carla memory, so the other guy in the final, they both became MPs. They both got selected for other seats and both got elected, and I obviously didn't. Anyway, so then I had to come home to Daisy and say, good news and bad news. Good news is I got selected. Bad news is I think the right thing to do is to move there as quickly as possible. That's the right thing to do. So we sort of need to move in the next 6 weeks, which, bless her, Daisy was okay with, but probably wasn't the news she was expecting.
it was really interesting. It was that whole time of Brexit, and I believe you were on the Get Brexit Done trail, and that's a really difficult one for some people to try and comprehend. Was that sort of the word on the doorstep? Why are you supporting Brexit?
Yeah, and again, I'm a big believer in I'm not a traditional conservative in many ways because I am a traditional conservative in that I think most conservatives are from working class background, but people outside of the party assume that we all went to Eton and stuff, and it's just not the case. But I'm not a traditional conservative in that I care about international development. It's not to say that other Tories don't care about it. It's just probably not something they'd make a career out of. So so anyway, I say that because I've always taken the view that you should be as honest and direct as people with people as you can possibly be. So I voted Leave and I campaigned for Leave because even though in my mind it was fairly balanced, and I probably certainly wasn't one of these people who felt that we needed to leave the EU and that we should have a referendum. But once the question was forced, I think if you're going to stand for office, you need to have an opinion on this. And Mark Prisk, brilliant former, best MP we've had in Hertford and Stortford, I would say. He was clear at the time. He said, "Look, I'm for Remain. None of us can sit on the fence." And I sort of took that to heart. And Mark probably won't be pleased that I'm, subsequently went for Leave. But I thought to myself, I don't want the UK to become any more integrated to the EU. And my fear was that if we voted to Remain, we would lose our leverage over the EU for the next 20 years. We would never again be able to say, we don't want this, blah, 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 because we would have effectively, as a country, endorsed the UK's participation. And I feared that would lead to a rapid integration, adopting the single currency, adopting or integrating our armed forces, more red tape, more regulation. So anyway, that was the background to it. So yeah, it did come up on the doorstep. It was a brutal campaign. I was the candidate for 14 months. So I was commuting from Bedford to South London, where I worked at Caffard. I was, pre-COVID, so I was in the office 5 days a week. It was shattering, and it was a brutal, brutal campaign. It was that Jeremy Corbyn sort of period where nothing was off the table. There was anti-Semitism. There was this belief that the Tories were sort of wrecking the country. I genuinely felt that if Corbyn had become Prime Minister, he would have eroded the sort of fabric of our society. I believe that still. But yeah, it was brutal. And when it did come up on the doorstep, and people that don't know Bedford, the biggest employer in Bedford is the local hospital, the NHS. There's a big university in the town centre, and there's incredible diversity. And I say all of that because being a Tory Brexiteer under Boris Johnson in 2019, I was not the most popular candidate by any stretch. But I just said, I would explain it as I just have, and I think that's all you can do. I think the worst thing is and we all hear them on TV. We're hearing them a lot at the moment because at the time we're having this conversation, of course, Labour are in the middle of taking out Keir Starmer, or so it would seem. But you hear these MPs and these ministers say, well, on the one hand this, on the one hand that. And I sort of feel like just have some conviction. There's so many politicians I don't agree with, but who I really respect because I believe that they believe what they're saying, and I think that's what's so desperately needed, and that helps us get beyond this wishy-washy, no one really stands for everything, soundbite focus groups, and I think it's driving everyone mad. So anyway, my final thing I'd say on this is I lost my election, so maybe a smarter person would have couched it differently, not made as many opponents. Held back on saying what they really thought, and maybe I would have become an MP, but then I wouldn't have been able to sleep at night. So you've got to pick you've got to make your choices.
You said that you were the candidate for 14 months. That is quite some time. I've got a few questions around this. Firstly, in the run-up, no one knew when the election would be, so you just keep campaigning, I suppose. And then when it finally gets announced that there is an election, what actually happens behind the scenes? Yeah,
it's hugely exciting. Really, really exciting, and it's also a relief, frankly, because you're right, and we never knew when the election was coming. So first thing to do, I phoned my boss and said, "Look, it's happening. I need to take 6 weeks of unpaid leave. Not ideal for my bank balance, especially when you work for a charity because you're not paid very well anyway." So yeah, so there was that. He knew it was coming, obviously, and he was brilliant. He's a socialist, so wished me well. Said, I hope the Tories lose every seat, but I hope you win. So that was an interesting start. So the first thing you did, yeah, I had a brilliant association chairman, Andrea Spice. She's currently a councillor in Bedford. Brilliant politician. Had a brilliant campaign manager, Jess. Brilliant. Everyone's a volunteer. Apart from Jess, everyone's a volunteer, and Jess is working 18-hour days, so she's effectively volunteering. She's definitely not paid to work 18-hour days. And yeah, you're just out from the moment you wake up until the moment you go to sleep. It's all campaigning. So I would start the day at maybe 6:30 in the morning, and I would be outside Bedford train station. And bear in mind, it's November, December, with my banner. I'm the Conservative candidate. Come and say hello. Not many people did because they're exhausted and tired, but I'd get a wave or a smile, and the odd person would chat. And then I'd go to a cafe, do a different cafe sort of every morning, or try to do a circuit and have some breakfast, have a coffee, talk to the owners, talk to anyone who talked to me in the cafe. And then as soon as you get to about 9:30, start knocking on doors and keep knocking on doors until about 7:30 in the evening. Going into Costa to use the gents, going into Tesco's to get a sandwich because remember I'm not being paid, so trying to be economical. And then in the evening, when it got really dark, and I'd feel uncomfortable knocking on doors after a certain time, particularly because you don't know if there's an elderly person in there who might be a bit spooked. Then I'd go to a supermarket and I'd stand just outside the entrance again with my banner, and people would come and talk to you. And sometimes they come and talk to you when you don't want them to come and talk to you. They tell you what they think of you, and it's not always pleasant. And often there'd be a hustings, and I think I did about 5 hustings in total. So yeah, getting booed and hissed from the back of a church is not something I was used to, but got used to that pretty quickly. It was amazing. It was cold. I got ill twice. But I mean, what a privilege. I always say this to people who are thinking of doing it. What an absolute privilege when you think of all the countries in the world that don't have these rights, and who or you think of candidates in many countries who are worried about the door being kicked in the middle of the night, just because they disagree with the government. To be able to do this and to be able to engage, it's an extraordinary privilege. And I've not glossed over the bad things here, but the good definitely outweighs the bad.
As a candidate, then, you mentioned that you were going to Tesco's and getting your sandwiches, and who was the one paying for that? Did you have to save up in the months leading up to it, or was there some sort of, someone out there paying for your sandwiches?
It was me. Yeah, it was me. Yeah, saved up. Yeah, saved up. And actually, I got married. The election was in December, and Daisy and I got married in the September. So, yeah. The good thing about being a candidate is your social life sort of plummets. So it's not like I was hanging out with friends or going to watch boxing or anything like stuff that I would normally spend money on. I wasn't for the 14 months. So, yeah. I saved up, basically.
Are you interested in football?
I am. I'm a Man United fan, so I've been deliberately psychologically semi-detached until about January of this year when Carrick took over and everything, But so yeah, I am interested in football.
That's an interesting one there. I think Carrick's going to be staying into next season. But what have you made of their campaign now Carrick is there?
Yeah, I mean, really, really, really positive. It says a lot about culture, doesn't it? And I think having someone who understands the DNA of the club, I think it makes such a difference. I mean, obviously, the proof will be in what happens next season, because we've been here before with Solskjaer, who actually, when compared with what came afterwards, history will be very kind, to Solskjaer. But at the time, it was a brilliant start, and then it sort of fell off. But no, I think it's really interesting, and it's a reminder that no matter how grim things look, you can turn it around. And obviously, sport is a lot different from politics, but it should serve as a sort of positive reminder that things can turn around quickly.
I think I needed to hear that as a Liverpool fan after this torrid campaign. Could you speak to us then about this whole election count? I mean, you lost by not even 200 votes. That must be so frustrating that you were so close but so far.
Yeah, so what I always say to people now is if you are on my team and I ever run for office again, don't expect an easy time. Because when I stood for the council in 2015, I won by 112 votes. Which was, I was having heart palpitations as the counts were coming up. when I stood for Parliament, I lost by 145 out of, I got like 20,000 votes or something. So 145 is really in the sort of 0.0, category. Then when I stood for town council, I won by a couple of hundred. That's been my biggest victory yet. And then when I stood for county council last May, out of 3,000 or 4,000, I lost by 59, which I think it was the closest election maybe on the county or certainly in Hertford. So there's always a drama with my election counts. That's the first thing. I mean, yeah, it was. I sort of felt on polling day, and everyone can be wise after the event, so take this with a pinch of salt. But I sort of felt it slipping away from me on polling day. We were knocking on doors. For those that haven't taken part in like a Get Out the Vote campaign, on polling day you're knocking on the doors of people that have said that they will support you. So if people that you're knocking on, because you're reminding them to go and vote, just for context. So if people are not sort of 95% with you, it's worrying, And I was getting about 80% with me. So we and they were going to the Brexit Party. So they weren't going to Labour, they weren't going to Lib Dems or anything like that. They were going to the Brexit Party, and it's so frustrating, because I voted Leave, I campaigned for Leave, and I'd said that I was behind Boris Johnson's, policies and stuff. So it was so frustrating. So I sort of felt it slip away. And then the exit poll came out, and they said Bedford's 99%. BBC was like, Bedford's 99% going to go Conservative. But my campaign manager got on the phone to me and she said, look, I've been processing the data all day, and we knew it was going to be tight. There was an MRP poll out in the Times 2 weeks before, and it showed it was going Labour. So we knew it was going to be close. But I tell you what, it's grim, because you're getting WhatsApps from people you haven't spoken to for 20 years who walked past you once in the corridor when you're doing maths in school. Like, well done, Ryan Henson MP. And you're just like, oh gosh, it's grim. Anyway, got to the count, and my team had sort of said, like, don't come because it's awful here, Got there, and it's pouring with rain. I mean, it's like a Hollywood film. And campaign manager comes out and she says, look, we're about 50 votes behind. There's one box left to count, and it's in the Paris ward. The Paris ward, for those who don't know Bedford, massive houses, very wealthy. These are people that would have voted Conservative for a century up until 2019, but Brexit had obviously caused a realignment. These people hated us now. They're annoyed because of Brexit. Fair enough. And I said to her, well, if we were 50 up, maybe we might squeak it by a vote. But I said, if we're 50 down and this is the bloody box that's left, I said, I don't think I've won. So then you go through like the 7 stages of grief. Like you sort of say, please God, let me get across the line. And then you sort of think to yourself, why have I lost? Why I bloody slogged my guts out. Why have I lost? And then eventually you sort of think to yourself, oh, okay, right, pull yourself together. It's grim for me. It sucks for me. But look at all these volunteers. Like they're not doing this because they get to be an MP at the end of it. They're doing it because they believe in the cause. So pull yourself together. Walked in, gave a speech, congratulated my opponents, thanked all my volunteers, and then off you go. So it was a really it was an emotional night, but also conflicting because the party had done so well nationally. You've got all that to be getting on with. But again, amazing experience, changed my life. Wouldn't change it. I mean, obviously I would have preferred to have won, but other than that, yeah, an awesome experience.
Well, you then returned back to Hertford, and you managed to win the Hertford Castle Ward by-election in September of 2024. I suppose that campaign was, not so pressurising in terms of having all these people, because obviously it's a smaller ward. What was it like to win there? Were you relieved to finally be back in the public domain?
Yeah, to some extent. So, I mean, the context was we'd had the 24 election and we'd lost, and I didn't stand in the 24 election. My work was blowing up, in a good way. And so I sat that one out, and there wasn't an obvious vacancy, to go for. So I had no intention of running for anything again. And then our new MP resigned his seat on the town council, so there was a vacancy. and we'd just been, worst defeat in our 200-year history as a party. But I felt really strongly that someone needed to do it. And I also thought that the Greens are running the town council, they're running the district council. We've now got a Labour MP who's speaking up for Hertford, who's not a lunatic socialist, basically. That was really felt that someone should sort of hold them to account. So that was my sort of belief, and I just said that on the doorstep. And it was August, had all this annual leave to take, so took a couple of weeks off. Campaigned 10 in the morning till 8 o'clock at night. I don't think people had ever experienced that in Hertford before, especially from a Tory candidate. And the response was fantastic. And I would say, look, and I was in my element because I love Hertford and from Hertford. I know Hertford. A lot of the people whose doors I would knock on, I either went to school with their kids, or I'd gone to Krav Maga with them at some point, or you'd sort of see them in church, or you just sort of see people about. And so it was great. I absolutely loved it, and I was relieved to win. But it was one of those. This is everyone says this after they've won, but the campaign was just such great fun, and so many people came out and supported, and it was such a boost after the horrible loss, and we lost our MP, obviously Julie. So it was it was a sort of really positive thing after a grim sort of July.
There's been some leaflets that I've been seeing over the last few months about you and your colleagues in the town council. Obviously, the other parties have been increasing taxes, and you've been trying to keep them down as best as you can. But so, what's been the insight in the Hertford in the Hertford Town Council?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that most of the councillors on the town council, who are almost entirely Green now. So there's me and Sue, who are Conservatives, and there's guy called Graham who's Labour, but the other dozen or so are Green. And I would say that many of them are in it for the right reasons. And I think it's important to say that we live in a time of division and toxicity, and I think it's important to say that, and it's true. But they're absolutely, utterly irresponsible in their approach to taxes and what's fair and what isn't. And to give you an explanation about what I mean by that, they have put up taxes on the town council every single year they've been in power, and they've tripled them in this past year. It's completely unacceptable at a time when the very poorest in our town are struggling to make ends meet, when the burden of taxation on everyone from national government is the highest it's been since the Second World War, at a time when the economy has barely grown, certainly barely grown under Rachel Reeves, one of the worst chancellors in post-war history, to then say to the residents of our town, we are going to tax you 3 or 4 times as much as we normally would, it's like a kick in the teeth. And they are so sort of fixated with their ideology that there's little space to persuade them, And I will say this for sort of the Labour councillor who's on the town council, you can have a debate with him and you can see where he's coming from. But when you're dealing with populists and people who have an ideology which is so strong, you just can't reason with them. And you can sort of speak to the councillors on the town council. I made the best speech I possibly could. I weighed all the arguments, and I even offered a compromise. I said, if you will reduce the extent to which you're increasing taxes, I'll come out and back it. It's not good for me as a Tory because I'm still agreeing to a tax increase, but I just want to make sure that the people who are vulnerable and people that are struggling to make ends meet. And by the way, just because someone's got a decent salary, we don't know what's going on in their private lives. They're struggling too. But I just couldn't make any headway at all, and that's what I find so frustrating. And unfortunately in Hertford now, the county councillors are Green, district councillors are Green, town councillors are Green, MPs Labour. We've got problems, and it's why I'm still involved. It's why I'm still knocking on doors. I'm still delivering the leaflets that you may have seen.
I know it's a really tough one, as you said there, to try and get inside a Green Party councillor's head. But what are they trying to say? They want to obviously raise taxes and do what with that money?
Yeah, well, it's a classic case of big government and believing that government is the answer to every single problem. So I think in Hertford, we are so fortunate because we have so much so much brilliant civil society. So to give you an example, the places that I've worked in, say, the Middle East or parts of Africa, there is no civil society a lot of the time. So if the government doesn't do it or the NGO doesn't do it, then people struggle. But Hertford isn't like that. We've got a thriving sort of community, and there isn't the need to fill every possible gap with more town council, basically. The town council is essentially there to make sure that we retain our civic traditions, that the mayor raises money for good causes, that the mayor and the officers of the council are held to account, and we look after cemeteries and allotments. I don't mean it to sound like none of that's important. I think it's incredibly important. That's why I give up my time to do it. But it's not, that's our remit. And what the Greens are trying to do is now interfere in every single aspect of what goes on in the town. So just a few weeks ago in March, at one of the town council meetings, they passed a motion to reduce all traffic in Hertford to 20 miles an hour. Now you can debate the merits of that. Do it, don't do it. How do we enforce it? Do the public actually want it? I don't know. Have that conversation by all means. But the town council, it's not responsible for the 20-mile-an-hour limit, And so every single time you have a meeting like that, and then you have to set up a working group, and then the officers need to work late, and then you need to get a consultant in to analyse it, costs more money, And this is what they're blowing it on. And the real risk is that we end up in Hertford like we've ended up in where they've voted to pay themselves an allowance. I don't get an allowance as a town council. I don't get expenses. And I don't think taxpayers of Hertford should pay more in their taxes to pay me. But that's the direction of travel that we're going in.
Well, I think that obviously it's very evident to see that the Green Party's grown nationwide, but also in the constituency, but in Ware and Hertford even more. You've mentioned there's a load of Green councillors on the town council in Ware, but in Hertford, you mentioned there's still a lot on there too. Do you think that the next election will be quite telling as to what this population of the constituency want? Because obviously Reform are knocking on the door. The Greens have been very successfully locally. Do the Conservatives stand much of a chance in the next election here?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm convinced of this, but I think we have to be very, very alive to what's at stake. And this isn't an ordinary election. This is a battle, really, for the soul, not just of Hertford and Stortford, but of the country. Do we want to cave to populism on the left, which is the Greens, and populism on the right, which is some aspect of what Reform are offering? I don't want to describe Reform to be entirely populist, because I think there's so many things that they're saying that resonate. So I don't want to be completely dismissive. But either way, as a party, we have to be very clear, first of all, what it is that we're going to do locally, what we stand for, not just what we're against. And I'm conscious that I've listed all the things that I'm against when I've been talking about the Greens, but also what we're for. We need to do that locally, and we need to do that nationally. And I'm absolutely convinced. I've fought 4 elections. I've won 2. I've lost 2. I've always thought that the public broadly get it right. They were, I'll be honest, they were right to kick us out in 2024. And I think they're right now to realise what a shoddy mess this Labour government is. And that's been reflected in the local election results. So I think if we can come up with a persuasive case for why it is we should be trusted, I think we'll be given a hearing. And I think locally, we have to be very clear about what it is that we stand for. And I always think Hertford, Ware, Bishop Stortford, Much Haddam, Sawbridgeworth, when I've been out knocking on doors campaigning for colleagues who have stood for council in those areas, not just in Hertford, I've always said, as a party, we are compassionate. We believe not just in rights, but in responsibility. We have a right as citizens to expect our government to remove the barriers so that everyone can get on, so that everyone can thrive, so that someone can start a business, so that our economy grows. But as citizens, we have a responsibility to work hard and to aspire. That's often lost in the debate. But I think as Conservatives, when we make those sorts of arguments, people respond. And I think if we can do that, then we've got a real chance. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm not saying we should expect 18,000 majorities. I think those days are gone. But I'm convinced that there's no other party that can offer that sort of message.
Well, when I spoke to Mark Prisk, he had some words to say about the current Labour MP Josh Dean. Could you talk to me about Josh? I mean, there must be some things in him that perhaps you could take on if you were to ever to run as an MP. And what's the negatives about Josh on the local level?
Yeah, so I'll say this about Josh. I met him when I was the candidate in Bedford. We did a radio debate in Luton for Free Counties Radio, and he was invited on as a sort of local citizen who, obviously masquerading as a Labour activist, but fair play to him. And I would say, again, in keeping with trying to be positive, he's a good guy, and I think he's in it for the right reasons. I think his heart's in the right place, and I've bumped into him literally on the campaign trail because Hertford's a small town, and I've always gone over to him and shaken his hand and inquired after his health and all that. That makes me sound like I'm born in the 1920s, but you know what I mean. I really respect him as an individual, but I would say that since he's got elected, I think Hertford's dropped off the map politically. And when we think about Mark, when he was the MP, he had the ear of number 10. He was a minister in the business department. He was respected by the sectors in which his brief covered, housing at one point. And he was he was a man of gravitas, right? When Mark weighed in on a debate, you knew about it. You may not agree with him, but you knew that he had a point of view and he stood by that. And I think we don't have that with Josh. I think we've got someone who's always voted with the government, even on stupid policies like abolishing the winter fuel payment. He was for it, and you need a character. You need someone who's going to stand up, not just for the country and their constituents, but the hardest thing of all often is to stand up against your own party. And Josh just hasn't done that. He hasn't done that at all. So that's the problem. I mean, I think of some of the challenges in Hertford. We have a train service at Hertford North, which really hasn't advanced in keeping with the growth of the town. It's an old-fashioned train timetable when we have a 2026, population. Where's Josh on this? When Rachel Reeves refuses to tackle welfare, where's Josh? 1 in 4 working adults are now classified as disabled. I'm not saying that, Josh needs to resign the whip and start his own campaign, but what's his opinion on this, other than just parroting whatever it is number 10 tell him? I just think Hertford deserves so much more than just a ten a penny MP, and that's what I'm afraid I see when I see Josh.
I know that's it's a hard question for you to answer, but I asked Josh that if he would ever decide to obviously run in the next election. I'm sure he would, but would he ever move out of this constituency? What's your thoughts on that? Because the likelihood is Josh may not be the MP after the next election.
Well, I hope Josh is no longer the MP after the next election, but I hope that's because we have a Conservative MP. But I mean, what he does is up to him, and I think it's a bad look. Personally, I think if you are privileged enough to represent your home, then you don't stop fighting for your home just because you lose, or just because, or worse, because you think you're going to lose. I mean, I wouldn't. I can't speak for everyone, but I just assume everyone's like that. So I'd be very surprised if he did that. But who knows? He's got to do what he thinks is right. I think it would be it'd be pretty bad for him and for Labour to do that. It would I think if you fought hard and you've worked hard for 4 or 5 years, then I think you've got a chance. And that's why I said in answer to your question about whether the Conservatives can win. Yeah, I think we can win, but I it's going to be a fight. So, that's news to me. It'll be interesting to see what he does, I guess.
The last question I've got for you is, do you have any political ambitions to head back and try and run as a Member of Parliament? If so, where would it be?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of got to a point after sort of weighing it all up last year, when the Conservative Party began its candidate process again. So what I mentioned earlier about, you need to apply for the list, and you need to sort of get on that list before you can think about standing for selection. And I sort of thought to myself, I'm in a great place with my career, and my wife and I starting a family, which we're really privileged to do, and I feel like I'm very fulfilled in my work. So I don't feel like I need to do this. However, when there's a vacancy in the seat where you live, where you've always lived, I think you're a fool if you don't consider it. So So that's something that I'm actively considering, and I think if I were to do it, it would only be for Hertford and Stortford. Um, and yeah, even when the association decide to, ask candidates to go forward, if I'm going to do it, that'll be the time. And yeah, if I do decide to go for it, I will go for it like I have in all my previous elections. I'm not promising a landslide, but I promise every sort of fibre of energy that I've got and passion and stuff. So yeah, it depends what the association want. Depends on that. But I'd be all in. I think if it came to Hertford and Stortford. But other than that, I'm happy where I am. So I certainly won't be standing anywhere else.
Well, Ryan, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.